belong here. Move out!
Gate agent kicks black girl's stomach, and minutes later she's fired on the spot in a way that proves sometimes the airport employees who assault children based on racist assumptions about stolen tickets are about to discover that violence against minors gets you arrested, gets you terminated before you can gather your belongings, gets you prosecuted in ways that end with federal prison sentences. Because what this gate agent named Vicki didn't know when she decided a 13-year-old black girl traveling alone must be criminal was that her assumption would escalate into assault so brutal it would leave child unconscious on terminal floor, would trigger emergency response that brought paramedics and police and security, would reach father who happened to be FAA executive with power to ensure she never worked in aviation again, would transform routine racial profiling into crime captured on dozens of phones, into evidence that would send her to prison for 7 years, into moment that would define rest of her life as the woman who kicked a child so hard she vomited and passed out, and the confidence with which Vicki grabbed Amara Hayes and accused her of theft, the rage with which she spun her around and delivered kick to her stomach, showed racism that felt comfortable becoming violence, that believed black child's pain was acceptable, that assumed no consequences would come. You people always lie, always cheat, you disgust me, kids like you don't travel alone. Who did you steal this ticket from? I know you're lying because people like you always lie. You don't belong here. You don't deserve to fly. Vicki Morrison said to Amara Hayes, who was standing at Gate 23 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport waiting to board United Airlines Flight 1456 to Phoenix, who was 13 years old and traveling alone to her grandmother's 80th birthday celebration, who'd been so excited that morning when her parents dropped her off, who clutched her backpack that contained handmade birthday cards she'd spent weeks creating, who had all her documentation in order, who'd flown alone before and knew the procedures, who'd done absolutely nothing except present her boarding pass and identification when requested, who'd been polite and respectful and compliant, who'd committed no crime except being black child in airport where gate agent had decided black children must be thieves, and Vicki's words hit Amara like assault before the physical assault came. Hit her with venom that communicated she was unwanted, was suspicious, was criminal based solely on her appearance, was less than human in Vicki's eyes. The accusations thief and liar and you people landed at Gate 23 with weight of every racist assumption that had ever been made about black people, landed with echoes of centuries of being presumed criminal, being denied benefit of doubt, being treated as threats rather than travelers, and Amara felt her hands start shaking as Vicki grabbed her arm and yanked her out of the boarding line, felt tears burning behind her eyes as other passengers turned to stare, felt humiliation wash over her as Vicki's loud accusations made everyone within hearing distance assume she'd done something wrong, and she tried to explain that her father had bought the ticket, that she had documentation, that she could call her parents, but Vicki talked over her, dismissed her explanations, treated her words as lies before she'd even finished speaking, and the powerlessness of being 13 and being accused by adult with authority, of having truth dismissed as deception, of being physically handled in public while people watched, made Amara feel small and scared and desperately alone. This wasn't something her parents had warned might happen in distant past. This wasn't discrimination her grandparents had faced during civil rights era that she only knew from history lessons. This was happening right now in 2025 at major American airport where policies against profiling supposedly existed, where children traveling alone were supposed to be protected, where gate agents were supposed to verify concerns through proper channels rather than through assault. But here was Vicki, grabbing her, accusing her, treating her like criminal who deserved rough handling, and if you think airport racism is something we solved decades ago, if you believe children are safe from adults who decide their skin color makes them suspicious, then you need to understand that hatred didn't disappear when laws changed, it just learned to operate in airports and schools and stores, learned to hide behind claims about security and stolen tickets and kids who don't belong, while inflicting same dehumanizing violence it always has, maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends we're beyond racism, while people deny that black children still get treated like threats, while gate agents feel comfortable assaulting minors because they assume no consequences will come. Amara had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with teachers who were surprised by her grades, store employees who followed her, adults who seemed skeptical that accomplished black girl could exist without some kind of fraud, but having gate agent physically grab her, publicly accuse her of theft, refuse to verify her documentation through proper procedures, felt different. Felt like hatred that had escalated beyond words into violence. Felt like danger that she couldn't escape. Because Vicki had authority and she had none, and she'd been shocked when Vicki first demanded to know where she'd gotten her ticket, had thought maybe there was legitimate concern that could be resolved with explanation, but as Vicki's language became explicitly racist, as she started saying you people and kids like you with contempt dripping from every word, Amara realized with sinking dread that this wasn't about verification. This was about racism. This was about gate agent who'd looked at black child and decided she was criminal, and while shocking it also wasn't entirely surprising because her parents had prepared her for racism, had told her it would happen, had warned her that being excellent wouldn't always protect her, but knowing racism existed didn't make experiencing it less traumatic, didn't make Vicki's hatred less painful, didn't prepare her for what came next. "Please, you're hurting me," Amara said as Vicki's grip on her arm tightened as she was pulled further from the boarding line, as other passengers watched without intervening. "Please, I just want to see my grandma. It's her 80th birthday, my dad bought the ticket, you can call him, please just call him and he'll explain everything." And her plea was desperate and young and heartbreaking, was child begging adult to stop hurting her, was innocence confronting hatred and trying to find humanity. But instead of softening Vicki's rage, instead of prompting recognition that she was terrorizing child, Amara's mention of her grandmother seemed to enrage Vicki further, seemed to make her angrier, seemed to trigger something that pushed her from verbal assault into physical violence. If you believe children deserve safety from adults who hate them for their skin color, keep watching, because what happens when this gate agent's racism becomes physical assault will show you that sometimes consequences actually come. And if you've ever been treated like criminal for existing while black, drop a comment below and tell us your story. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when assaulting child reaches father with power to destroy careers. This story doesn't end the way Vicki thinks, so hit that like button if you stand against violence targeting children and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing airport racism that ends in arrests. Vicki spun Amara around with force that made her stumble. Spun her so they were face to face, so Amara could see hatred in her eyes, so she could deliver her next words with venom that felt like physical blow. "You disgust me," and without warning, without hesitation, Vicki drew back her foot and drove it directly into Amara's stomach with force that no adult should ever use against child, with violence that was shocking in its brutality, with kick that was designed to hurt, to punish, to teach. This black girl that questioning white authority had consequences, but to understand how a bright 13-year-old honor student with perfect documentation and loving parents ended up being physically assaulted at airport gate, how routine solo flight to grandmother's birthday became trauma that would require surgery and months of recovery, how Vicki Morrison's racism escalated from profiling to physical violence that would send her to prison. We need to go back 8 hours to a morning in Dallas where this day started not with hatred but with excitement and careful preparation and family's love for their grandmother who was turning 80. Amara Rose Hayes, 13 years old and 8th grader at Dallas Preparatory Academy, was exactly the kind of student teachers loved, was responsible and polite and genuinely curious about learning, was girl who made honor roll every semester, who volunteered at her mother's supermarket on weekends helping elderly customers, who'd won the school's writing contest 2 years running, who wanted to be journalist someday because she believed stories could change the world, could expose injustice, and celebrate triumph, could give voice to people who weren't being heard, and she carried that sense of purpose into everything she did, carried notebooks everywhere to document observations, carried camera to capture moments that mattered, carried belief that paying attention and caring deeply were the foundations of making difference. And her parents Richard and Lauren Hayes had raised her to be confident without being entitled, to be aware of racism without being defined by it, to expect dignity while understanding that demanding it sometimes required courage. Richard Hayes was FAA Executive Division official, was one of highest-ranking black men in Federal Aviation Administration, was someone whose signature could ground entire fleets if safety violations were discovered, whose authority extended across American aviation in ways most people never considered, and he'd spent 25 years building that career, building credibility through excellence that couldn't be dismissed, building relationships with airline CEOs who respected his judgment, building power that he'd hoped would protect his daughter from exactly the kind of racism she was about to experience, but power at work didn't translate to protection everywhere, didn't prevent gate agents from profiling his child, didn't stop hatred from targeting his daughter when he wasn't there to defend her. Lauren Hayes owned 3 supermarkets in Dallas, had built successful business through combination of hard work and community investment, had stores that employed over 100 people, that served neighborhoods that other chains had abandoned, that proved Black women could be successful entrepreneur while raising family and maintaining values, and she taught Amara about dignity and resilience, about facing challenges without losing yourself, about being proud of who you were even when world told you that you were less than. That morning Amara had woken early with excitement that made her check her backpack 3 times, check that she had the birthday card she'd made for her grandmother, check that she had her sketch of grandmother's house in Phoenix that she'd drawn from memory, check that she had all the small gifts she'd carefully selected, and her grandmother Evelyn Hayes was turning 80, was a woman who'd raised 5 children during segregation, who'd marched in civil rights protests, who'd faced down hatred. That made modern racism seem subtle by comparison, who'd taught Amara about strength and grace, about meeting cruelty with dignity rather than bitterness, about being proud Black woman in America even when America didn't always value Black women. And Amara loved her grandmother with fierce devotion, wanted to be there for this milestone birthday, wanted to celebrate women who'd sacrificed so much to create opportunities her family now enjoyed. Richard had driven Amara to the airport himself even though he had important meetings scheduled, had wanted these extra minutes with his daughter, had talked during the drive about responsibility and about calling if anything felt wrong and about how proud he was of her maturity, and he'd reviewed emergency procedures they'd practiced, had made sure she had his direct number and Lauren's number and grandmother's number programmed into her phone, had reminded her that she'd flown alone before. And, done perfectly, had told her that being independent was privilege that came with responsibility to stay safe, and he'd hugged her tight at departures and said, "I love you, baby girl, call me when you land, Grandma is so excited to see you," and Amara had smiled and said, "I love you too, Daddy, I'll be fine, I'll text you from the gate," and she'd walked into the terminal feeling confident, feeling ready, feeling like this trip was going to be wonderful. Check-in had gone smoothly, TSA security had been routine with officers who were professional and efficient, and Amara had proceeded to her gate with plenty of time before boarding, had found seat in waiting area and pulled out her book, had texted her parents that everything was fine, had felt calm and prepared, and other passengers at Gate 23 were typical mix of business travelers and families, people absorbed in phones and laptops, and nobody paid particular attention to teenagers sitting quietly reading until Vicki Morrison had taken her position at the gate desk, had looked up from her computer and scanned the waiting passengers, and her eyes had landed on Amara and something had shifted in her expression, something that suggested she'd decided this Black girl sitting alone required investigation. Vicki was white, probably in her early 50s, had worked as gate agent for 12 years, and she carried herself with authority of someone who controlled access to aircraft, who decided who boarded and who didn't, who had power over passengers in ways that could make travel smooth or nightmarish. And when she'd looked at Amara, her face had shown suspicion that seemed automatic, seemed like learned response rather than reasoned assessment, seemed like she'd looked at Black child traveling alone and decided something must be wrong, must require investigation, must warrant closer scrutiny than white passengers received. And as boarding time approached, as passengers began lining up, Vicki's attention kept returning to Amara, kept focusing on this teenager who sat quietly reading, who'd done nothing to draw attention except exist as Black girl in airport, and when first class and premium passengers were called to board, when Amara stood and gathered her backpack and joined the line. Vicki's suspicion transformed into action, into decision that this child needed to be stopped, needed to be questioned, needed to prove she belonged. "You," Vicki called out, pointing directly at Amara, "come here, come to the desk right now," and her tone carried authority that made other passengers turn to look, that made Amara's stomach drop with sudden anxiety, that communicated she was being singled out for reasons she didn't understand, and Amara stepped out of the boarding line and approached the gate desk with heart that had started racing, with hands that trembled slightly as she clutched her backpack straps, with mind racing through everything her parents had taught her about staying calm and being polite and following instructions, and she said with voice that tried to sound confident despite her fear, "Yes, ma'am, how can I help you?" and her politeness, her deference, her attempt to be respectful, should have been met with basic courtesy, should have prompted professional response, should have resulted in quick verification and permission to board. But instead Vicki snatched Amara's boarding pass from her hand, snatched it with force that communicated hostility rather than routine procedure, snatched it while looking at Amara with expression mixing disgust and suspicion, and she said, "Where did you get this? Where did this ticket come from? How did you get access to this flight?" And her questions weren't asked with genuine curiosity or professional concern, were asked with tone that assumed guilt, that communicated she'd already decided. Amara had done something wrong, that treated legitimate boarding pass as evidence of crime rather than proof of purchase, and Amara felt confusion mixing with her anxiety, felt like she'd stumbled into a situation where normal rules didn't apply, where her documentation wouldn't matter because Vicki had decided based on appearance alone that something was wrong. "My dad bought it," Amara said, her voice still trying to maintain politeness despite the fear building in her chest. "My father purchased this ticket for me to fly to Phoenix to see my grandmother. It's her 80th birthday. He booked it 3 weeks ago. Everything is legitimate." And she tried to smile, tried to be reassuring, tried to communicate that she understood Vicki might have concerns but that those concerns could be quickly resolved through simple verification, but Vicki snorted at her. Explanation actually made sound of contempt that communicated she didn't believe a word Amara was saying, that she dismissed the explanation before it was complete, that she decided this black girl's father couldn't have legitimately purchased first-class ticket. "Sure he did," Vicki said with sarcasm that made nearby passengers look uncomfortable. "Sure your dad bought you a ticket? I'm sure that's exactly what happened. Now show me your identification, show me everything you have, because this doesn't look right, this doesn't add up. Kids like you don't travel alone, kids like you don't have tickets like this," and her phrase "kids like you" hung in the air heavy with racist implication, hung with meaning that everyone within hearing understood, hung with assumption that black children were inherently suspicious, inherently criminal, inherently undeserving of first-class tickets or solo travel or basic benefit of doubt, and Amara felt tears threatening as she pulled out her school ID and her passport from her backpack, as she handed over documentation that proved everything she'd said, that showed her name matched the boarding pass, that demonstrated she was exactly who she claimed to be. Vicki examined Amara's identification with scrutiny that went far beyond what was necessary, held her passport up to the light like she was checking for forgery, compared the photo to Amara's face multiple times like she suspected impersonation, took so long that other passengers in line started getting impatient, started shifting and checking their watches and wondering why boarding was delayed. And finally Vicki handed the documents back, but instead of apologizing for the delay, instead of acknowledging that everything was in order, she shook her head and said, "This doesn't add up. Something is wrong here. Kids like you don't travel alone. Kids like you don't have documentation like this unless something fraudulent is happening. Who did you steal this ticket from? Tell me the truth right now or I'm calling security." The accusation of theft hit Amara like physical blow, hit her with force that made her hands shake visibly, hit her with recognition that she was being accused of crime based solely on her skin color, that no amount of documentation would satisfy Vicki because Vicki had decided she was guilty, and Amara felt tears starting to fall as she said, "I didn't steal anything. I promise I didn't steal anything. Please, you can call my parents. My dad is Richard Hayes. He works for the FAA. My mom is Lauren Hayes. She owns Hayes Supermarkets. Please just call them and they'll confirm everything. I have their numbers. I can give you all their information. Please don't accuse me of stealing when I didn't do anything wrong." "I didn't steal anything," Amara repeated, her voice breaking now with tears that she couldn't hold back anymore. "Please, you can call my parents. They'll explain everything. My grandmother is waiting for me in Phoenix. It's her birthday. I made her a card. I have presents for her. Please just let me board. Please don't do this." And her plea was heartbreaking in its desperation, was child begging adult to stop terrorizing her, was innocence confronting baseless accusation and trying to find justice through explanation. But Vicki's response was to tell her to shut up, was to dismiss her tears as manipulation, was to grab her arm with grip that was designed to hurt, was to escalate from verbal harassment into physical assault that would transform this confrontation from discrimination into crime, and Amara felt Vicki's fingers dig into her bicep with force that made her gasp, felt herself being yanked out of the boarding line with violence that communicated she was being treated as criminal rather than passenger, felt humiliation wash over her as every person at Gate 23 turned to stare at the black girl being physically handled by gate agent. "Shut up," Vicki said with voice that carried across the gate area, with volume that ensured maximum audience for Amara's humiliation, with tone that communicated she expected obedience rather than explanation. "I don't want to hear your lies. I don't want to hear your excuses. Kids like you always have stories, always have explanations, always try to talk your way out of consequences. But I see through you. I know what you are. I know you stole this ticket or scammed someone or did something fraudulent because people like you don't have legitimate access to first class, don't have the resources for this kind of travel, don't belong on flights like this." And her racism was explicit now, was delivered with confidence that suggested she expected support from watching passengers, that suggested she believed articulating these assumptions was appropriate gate agent behavior rather than discriminatory abuse that would cost her everything. Other passengers in the boarding line were watching this confrontation with expressions mixing discomfort and curiosity, were witnessing gate agent physically grab 13-year-old girl, were hearing explicit racist language about kids like you and people like you, were seeing child cry and beg while adult with authority dismissed her tears, and some passengers looked genuinely disturbed, looked like they recognized something wrong was happening, looked like they wanted to intervene, but not. One person spoke up. Not one adult said leave that child alone. Not one passenger challenged Vicki's authority or questioned her accusations, and their collective silence felt like permission, felt like validation, felt like agreement that black child suffering was acceptable as long as it didn't inconvenience their own boarding, and Amara felt abandoned by every person in this terminal. Felt like she was facing Vicki's hatred completely alone despite being surrounded by witnesses who could have helped but chose not to. "Please, you're hurting me," Amara said as Vicki's grip on her arm tightened, as she was pulled further from the boarding line toward the side of the gate area, as the physical pain from Vicki's fingers digging into her arm joined the emotional pain of being publicly accused and humiliated. "Please let go, you're hurting my arm. I didn't do anything wrong. I just want to see my grandma," and her words were breaking with sobs now. Were coming between gasps as she tried to breathe through tears, were plea from child who didn't understand why adult was hurting her, who couldn't comprehend what she'd done to deserve this treatment, who wanted her parents with desperation that made her chest ache, who felt powerless in ways that were terrifying. Vicki spun Amara around with force that made her stumble, spun her so they were face to face, so Amara could see the hatred in Vicki's eyes up close, could see the disgust twisting her features, could see that this adult genuinely despised her based on nothing except her skin color. And Vicki leaned close and said with voice that dripped venom, "You people always lie, always cheat, always think you can get away with stealing and fraud. You disgust me, you and everyone like you disgust me. Thinking you can travel like real passengers, thinking you deserve the same treatment as people who actually belong here, but I see through you, I know what you are, and I'm not letting you on my flight. I'm not allowing you to steal a seat that should go to legitimate passenger." And her words were designed to wound, were calculated to dehumanize, were racism delivered with such confidence it suggested she'd expressed similar hatred before without consequences. Tears streamed down Amara's face in rivers now, streamed without her being able to stop them, streamed while her whole body shook with sobs she was trying to suppress, and she whispered through her crying, "I just want to see my grandma. It's her birthday, she's turning 80, I made her a card. Please just let me go. Please stop hurting me. I didn't do anything wrong." And there was something about those words, something about Amara mentioning her grandmother, something about this child's simple desire to celebrate family milestone, that seemed to enrage Vicki even further rather than softening her, that seemed to trigger escalation rather than de-escalation, that pushed her from verbal abuse and physical restraint into violence that would change everything. Nearby passengers were pulling out phones now, were recording this confrontation, were capturing Vicki's racism and Amara's tears on video that would be shared millions of times, that would make this moment public, that would ensure evidence existed. But their recording didn't translate into intervention, didn't mean they were willing to use their voices in real time to defend this child, didn't mean they valued her safety enough to risk their own comfort by challenging authority, and watching them film while staying silent, watching them document her suffering without trying to stop it, made Amara feel like she was being violated twice. Once by Vicki and once by passengers who treated her trauma as content rather than as crisis requiring immediate response. If you're watching this and you've ever filmed injustice instead of stopping it, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who intervenes, who uses their voice to protect vulnerable people even when it's uncomfortable, who understands that recording isn't helping if you stay silent while someone suffers, because what happens next when Vicki's rage escalates will haunt you, will show you what silence costs. So hit that subscribe button if you believe adults should. Protect children, not assault them. A white businessman 3 positions back in the boarding line shifted uncomfortably, opened his mouth like he might say something, like he might challenge Vicki's treatment of this child, but then he looked at Vicki's face twisted with rage and he closed his mouth again, decided silence was safer, decided his flight wasn't worth delaying even if defending child was morally right, and his moment of almost courage followed by retreat into complicity was witnessed by Amara, who'd looked at him with desperate hope, who'd thought maybe this man would help, who watched that hope die as he turned his attention back to his phone and pretended he wasn't seeing what was happening 3 feet in front of him. Vicki's face had gone red with fury now, had transformed from professional gate agent into someone whose hatred had completely overridden judgment, whose racism had escalated past verbal abuse into territory where physical violence felt justified, where hurting this child felt like appropriate response to her continued existence, to her refusal to simply disappear, to her insistence that she had right to board this flight. And Vicki spun Amara around one more time with such force that Amara cried out in pain, and she looked at this crying 13-year-old, at this child who'd done nothing except try to visit her grandmother, at this girl whose only crime was being black in space where Vicki had decided black children didn't belong, and instead of recognition that she'd gone too far, instead of shame at having reduced child to sobbing mess, Vicki felt only rage that this girl's tears hadn't resulted in compliance, that Amara was still standing there rather than running away, that her suffering hadn't been sufficient punishment, and something in Amara's whispered plea about her grandmother, something about this child's simple desire to celebrate 80-year-old woman's birthday, triggered final escalation that no one watching anticipated, that crossed line from discrimination into criminal assault. Without warning, without hesitation, without any visible struggle with the decision, Vicki drew back her right foot and drove it directly into Amara's stomach with force that no adult should ever use against child, with violence that was shocking in its brutality, with kick that was designed to hurt, to punish, to inflict maximum pain on 13-year-old girl whose body was unprepared for impact, whose muscles weren't tensed for blow, whose slight frame absorbed full force of adult woman's rage delivered through physical assault, and the kick connected with Amara's abdomen just below her ribs with sound that made nearby passengers gasp, with impact that bent Amara forward instantly, with violence that transformed gate area from space of verbal confrontation into crime scene. The pain that exploded through Amara's body was unlike anything she'd ever experienced, was white-hot agony that radiated from point of impact through her entire torso, was sensation so overwhelming it short-circuited her ability to process what had happened, to understand that adult had just kicked her, that gate agent had escalated from grabbing to assault, that she was experiencing physical violence in airport terminals surrounded by witnesses, and Amara's legs gave out immediately, gave out. Because her body couldn't remain upright while processing this level of pain, gave out because the kick had driven air from her lungs and sent shockwaves through her nervous system, and she crumpled to the floor gasping, trying desperately to breathe, trying to pull air into lungs that felt paralyzed, trying to scream but producing no sound except small choking gasps. Passengers throughout Gate 23 gasped audibly, gasped with shock at what they just witnessed, gasped with horror that adult had kicked child hard enough to drop her to the ground, gasped with recognition that they'd been watching situation escalate and hadn't intervened, and now child was on the floor in obvious agony, and a woman somewhere behind Amara shrieked, made sound of pure horror that pierced through the terminal noise, made sound that communicated she couldn't believe what she'd just seen, and a man shouted, "What the hell is wrong with you?" shouted at Vicki with fury that came too late to prevent assault but at least represented someone finally using their voice, finally breaking the silence that had enabled this escalation, finally recognizing that watching wasn't neutral but was complicity. Amara couldn't breathe, couldn't pull air into her lungs no matter how hard she tried, couldn't do anything except curl on the terminal floor with arms wrapped around her stomach, with face pressed against cold tile, with tears and saliva mixing on her cheeks, with body that was betraying her by refusing to function, by failing to provide oxygen her brain desperately needed, by trembling and convulsing in ways she couldn't control. And the pain wasn't lessening, wasn't becoming manageable, was, if anything, intensifying as her body processed the trauma, as internal injuries that hadn't been immediately apparent started making themselves known, as something fundamental had been damaged by the force of Vicki's kick, and Amara's vision started to blur at the edges, started to go gray and then dark, started to fade as her body shut down non-essential functions to deal with crisis. Amara's body convulsed violently, convulsed with spasm that came from deep in her core, convulsed in a way that brought everything in her stomach rushing up her throat, and she vomited onto the terminal floor, vomited while still gasping for air, vomited while passengers watched in horror, vomited with violence that suggested serious internal injury, that suggested this wasn't just pain from impact but damage that required immediate medical attention, and the vomit was mixed with blood, was showing evidence of internal bleeding that made several passengers cry out, that made the situation transform from assault to medical emergency, that made clear Amara needed ambulance, not airport security, needed hospital, not gate agents' continued presence. The terminal floor was cold against Amara's cheek, was hard and unforgiving beneath her body, was surface where she lay in her own vomit, unable to move, unable to call for her parents, unable to do anything except experience pain that was beyond her ability to endure, and she tried to stay conscious, tried to focus on anything that would keep her anchored to awareness, tried to think about her grandmother waiting in Phoenix, about the birthday card in her backpack, about her parents who would be devastated when they learned what happened, but consciousness was slipping away despite her efforts, was fading like lights being turned off one by one, was leaving her in darkness that felt like drowning, and then everything went black, went completely dark, went silent and still as Amara lost consciousness on Gate 23 floor surrounded by strangers who'd watched her be assaulted and done nothing until it was too late. Chaos erupted the moment Amara went limp, erupted as passengers who'd been frozen by shock finally moved into action, erupted too late to prevent the assault but at least representing some attempt to help, and bystanders rushed forward, rushed to where Amara lay unconscious, rushed with phones already out calling 911, calling for help that should have been summoned minutes ago when Vicki first grabbed her, that should have been requested when verbal abuse started, that was coming now only. Because child had been kicked so hard she'd vomited blood and passed out, and their belated response, their delayed intervention, their willingness to help only after violence had reached its peak, showed moral failure of everyone who'd watched this escalate. Someone call an ambulance, a woman screamed, her voice breaking with panic, she's not breathing, oh my God she's not breathing, someone help her, and the panic in her voice communicated what everyone could see, that Amara's chest wasn't rising and falling properly, that her breathing was shallow and irregular, that she needed immediate medical attention, that the assault had caused injuries serious enough to threaten her life, and passengers who had medical training pushed forward trying to help, trying to assess her condition while waiting for paramedics, trying to determine if she needed CPR or if moving her would cause more damage, and they knelt beside Amara's unconscious body checking for pulse, checking for breathing, checking for signs of life while her blood-tinged vomit pooled on the terminal floor, while her face remained pale and still, while precious seconds ticked by that could mean difference between recovery and permanent injury. A white mother who'd been traveling with her 2 young children, who'd been standing in the boarding line when the assault happened, who'd watched the entire confrontation in horror, pushed her way through the crowd gathering around Amara, pushed forward while shielding her children's eyes from the scene, while her own face showed rage that had finally found voice, and she turned to Vicki who stood frozen several feet away, turned with fury that made her shake, and she screamed, "You monster, hey! Absolute monster. She's a child, she's a baby and you kicked her. What is wrong with you? How could you do this? How could anyone do this to a child?" And her screaming represented what everyone should have been saying minutes ago, represented moral outrage that should have prevented the assault rather than following it, represented recognition that had come too late to protect Amara but at least acknowledged the horror of what had occurred. Vicki stood frozen in place, stood with face that had gone pale, stood with hands that trembled as reality of what she'd done started penetrating through her rage, started making her understand that she'd just committed crime in front of dozens of witnesses, that she'd assaulted minors so severely the child had lost consciousness, that her racism had escalated into violence that would have consequences she'd never faced before. And she looked at Amara lying motionless on the floor, looked at the blood in her vomit, looked at the crowd gathering and the phones recording, looked at her career ending in real time, looked at evidence of assault that would send her to prison, and her face showed dawning horror, showed recognition that she'd destroyed her own life, showed understanding that this moment would define her forever, but notably her horror seemed focused on consequences for herself rather than concern for child she'd harmed, seemed centered on what would happen to her rather than what she'd done to Amara. Airport security arrived within minutes, arrived running through the terminal with radios crackling, arrived to find unconscious child surrounded by panicked passengers and gate agents standing frozen, arrived to scene that was clearly medical emergency requiring immediate response, and they called for paramedics while securing the area, while moving passengers back, while one officer knelt beside Amara checking vitals, while another approached Vicki asking what happened here, what occurred, why. Is this child unconscious? And multiple passengers started talking at once, started explaining that gate agent had assaulted the girl, had accused her of theft and then kicked her in the stomach, had caused injuries that resulted in vomiting blood and loss of consciousness, and their accounts corroborated each other, made clear this wasn't accident or misunderstanding but deliberate assault witnessed by dozens of people. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes of the initial 911 call, arrived with equipment and training, arrived to find 13-year-old girl unconscious with irregular breathing and signs of internal bleeding, arrived to scene that required immediate transport to trauma center, and they worked quickly assessing her condition, checking her vitals, preparing her for transport while asking passengers what happened, how long she'd been unconscious, whether she'd hit her head when she fell, and passengers explained about the kick, about the force of impact, about the vomiting and the blood, about how she'd crumpled and then gone completely still, and the paramedics' faces showed concern that communicated Amara's injuries were serious, that internal bleeding from blunt force trauma to abdomen could be life-threatening, that she needed hospital immediately. They lifted Amara onto stretcher with care that tried to minimize movement, that tried to protect potentially injured organs, that treated her with gentleness that contrasted sharply with violence she'd experienced minutes earlier, and they rushed her toward the ambulance with 4 already started, with oxygen mask covering her pale face, with monitors tracking vitals that showed she was alive but unstable, that showed her body was in shock, that showed she needed surgery, and watching them carry her away, watching this child who'd been excited about her grandmother's birthday being rushed to emergency room, made passengers who'd stayed silent during the assault feel guilt that would stay with them, made them recognize their complicity, made them understand that their silence had enabled escalation that might have been prevented if anyone had intervened earlier. One security officer remained with the crowd asking for witnesses, asking who had recorded the incident, asking passengers to provide contact information for statements, and nearly everyone raised their hands, nearly everyone had video, nearly everyone had captured at least part of the assault, and their abundance of documentation, their dozens of phone recordings, stood in stark contrast to their absence of intervention, showed they'd been willing to film but not to help, willing to capture evidence but not to prevent harm, willing to be witnesses after the fact but not defenders in the moment, and the officer collected their information knowing this case would be prosecuted aggressively, knowing video evidence from multiple angles would make conviction certain, knowing Vicki's assault had been so thoroughly documented there would be no possibility of claiming misunderstanding or accident. Another security officer approached Vicki asking for her employee badge, asking her to remain in place, informing her she was being detained pending investigation, and Vicki numbly handed over her credentials, numbly stood where she was told, numbly watched as her career and her freedom slipped away, and she tried to speak, tried to explain, tried to say something about the girl being suspicious, about thinking the ticket was stolen, about just trying to do her job, but the officer cut her off, saying, "Ma'am, you need to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you. You should wait for legal representation," and his warning communicated she was suspect not witness, was perpetrator not victim, was criminal who'd committed assault rather than employee who'd made mistake. One of the paramedics who'd been treating Amara asked the security officers if they had contact information for the girl's parents, asked who should be notified, asked where to send updates about her condition, and an officer looked through Amara's backpack that had fallen during the assault, looked for phone or wallet or emergency contacts. And a bystander who'd been standing near Amara when she collapsed said I grabbed her phone when it fell. I have it here. Maybe there's parent contact in recent calls. And he unlocked the phone using face recognition while Amara was still barely conscious. Unlocked it and scrolled through recent calls and found entry labeled Dad, found number that would connect to Richard Hayes, found contact that would transform this from local assault into federal case, found connection that would ensure Vicki's consequences extended far beyond criminal prosecution into complete destruction of her ability to ever work in aviation again, and the security. Officer took the phone and stepped away from the crowd and pressed call and waited while it rang once, twice, while Richard Hayes sat in FA meeting completely unaware his daughter was being loaded into ambulance. Hello, Amara. Richard's voice came through the phone with warmth that expected to hear his daughter's voice, with tone that anticipated her telling him she'd boarded safely, with love that made the security officer's next words even harder to deliver. And there was brief pause where Richard must have registered that breathing on the other end wasn't his daughter's, that silence didn't feel right, that something was wrong. And the officer said, Sir, this is Officer Martinez with Dallas, Fort Worth Airport Police. There's been an incident involving your daughter. She's being transported to Parkland Memorial Hospital. We need you to get there as soon as possible. And his words were professional and controlled but carried urgency that communicated serious situation. That suggested Richard needed to move immediately, that implied Amara's condition was critical. The silence on the other end of the line lasted 3 seconds that felt like eternity, lasted while Richard processed that his daughter who he dropped at airport 2 hours ago was somehow injured seriously enough to require hospital transport, lasted while his mind raced through possibilities trying to understand what could have happened, lasted while fear gripped him with intensity that made breathing difficult, and then his voice came back different. Came back with steel underneath, came back with controlled fury of parent whose child has been harmed, and he said, what happened to my daughter? Tell me exactly what happened. Why is she going to the hospital? What are her injuries? And his questions came rapid fire, came with authority of someone accustomed to getting immediate answers, came with tone that demanded truth, not sanitized version. Officer Martinez took breath and delivered facts that would change Richard's life. Delivered explanation that would transform him from concerned father into avenging force. Said, Sir, your daughter was accused by gate agent of having stolen ticket. The gate agent became physically aggressive, grabbed your daughter, and then assaulted her by kicking her in the stomach. Your daughter lost consciousness. She vomited blood. Paramedics are transporting her now with possible internal injuries. We have multiple witnesses and video evidence. The gate agent is being detained, and his clinical delivery of these facts, his professional recitation of assault details, couldn't mask horror of what he was describing, couldn't hide that child had been brutally attacked by adult in position of authority, couldn't soften blow of learning your daughter had been kicked so hard she'd lost consciousness. Silence again. Silence that was different this time. Silence that felt dangerous rather than shocked. Silence that communicated Richard was processing not just information but implications, was understanding that gate agent had racially profiled his daughter, had assaulted her based on assumption that black child couldn't have legitimate ticket, had injured her so severely she needed emergency medical care. And when Richard spoke again, his voice was quiet, was controlled, was terrifying in its calmness, and he said, I'm leaving right now. I'll be at the hospital within 20 minutes, and officer, I need you to listen carefully. I need you to secure all evidence. I need witness statements taken. I need that gate agent held until police arrive, because I'm calling your CO personally. I'm calling every contact I have. My name is Richard Hayes, FAA Executive Division, and that agent will never work in aviation again. Do you understand me? She assaulted my child and I'm going to ensure she faces every possible consequence. Officer Martinez felt chill run down his spine hearing Richard's title, hearing FAA Executive Division, understanding that Vicki hadn't just assaulted random child but had attacked daughter of man with power to ground airlines, with authority that extended across American aviation industry, with connections to every CEO and every regulatory body, with resources to ensure prosecution was aggressive and consequences were maximum. And he said, yes, sir, I understand, we're securing everything. Gate agent isn't going anywhere, and sir, your daughter is getting best possible care. Paramedics said she's stable for transport, and Richard said stable isn't good enough. My daughter was fine 2 hours ago. My daughter was excited about seeing her grandmother. My daughter is 13 years old and someone kicked her hard enough to make her vomit blood. Stable is not acceptable, and he hung up without waiting for response. Hung up to start making calls that would destroy Vicki's life. Hung up to mobilize power he'd spent career building. Within 5 minutes, Richard had called the CEO of the airline, had reached man he'd known for 15 years, had spoken with someone who owed him favors, had delivered news that one of his gate agents had assaulted FAA executive's daughter, had explained the assault in detail, had made clear this wasn't going away quietly, wasn't something that could be handled with apology and settlement, was crime that demanded termination and prosecution, and the CEO's response was immediate, was horror. Mixed with recognition that this was catastrophic for airline, was promise that agent would be fired within the hour, was assurance that full cooperation with investigation would be provided, was understanding that Richard Hayes had power to make his airline's life very difficult if this wasn't handled properly. Richard called his wife Lauren next, called while driving toward hospital, called to deliver news that would devastate her, said baby Amara was hurt, said she was assaulted at airport, said she's unconscious, said meet me at Parkland emergency room right now, and Lauren's scream through the phone was sound of mother's heart breaking, was sound of parent learning their child had been harmed, was sound that Richard would never forget, was sound that fueled his determination to ensure Vicki Morrison paid for every second of suffering she'd caused. Back at the airport, Vicki stood surrounded by security, stood watching passengers board the flight she'd been working, stood recognizing her career was over, stood understanding she was about to be arrested, and terminal manager approached with face that was pale, with expression that showed he'd just received call from CEO, with knowledge that he was about to fire employee who'd worked for airline 12 years. And he said, Vicki Morrison, you're terminated effective immediately. Clear your badge. Do not speak. Legal will be in contact. And his words were delivered in front of hundreds of passengers, were witnessed by everyone at Gate 23, were public humiliation that preceded arrest, were announcement that made Vicki understand her life as she'd known it was ending, that 12 years of employment meant nothing against assault she'd committed, that no amount of seniority or past performance would protect her from consequences of kicking child so hard she'd lost consciousness. Vicki stammered, trying to form words, trying to explain herself even though terminal manager had told her not to speak, trying to make someone understand that she'd thought the girl was suspicious, that she'd believed the ticket was stolen, that she'd been trying to protect airline from fraud, and she said it was just, she was, I thought. But terminal manager cut her off with voice that carried no sympathy, with tone that communicated her explanations were irrelevant, with finality that showed decision had been made at highest levels, and he said, save it for your lawyer, you're going to need one, because what you did was caught on camera, was witnessed by dozens of people, was assault on minor that will result in criminal charges, and nothing you say now will change that. Now hand over your badge and your gate access and leave airline property immediately. Vicki's hands shook as she removed her employee badge, shook as she handed over credentials she'd worn for 12 years, shook with recognition that she was being fired in most humiliating way possible, in front of passengers she'd been serving, in front of colleagues who'd witnessed her assault child, in front of security who would now escort her out like criminal rather than employee, and tears started forming in her eyes, started falling as reality crashed over her, as she understood that her racism had finally found consequences she couldn't escape, that assault had been too public and too brutal and too thoroughly documented to be minimized or explained away, and her tears weren't for Amara who lay unconscious in ambulance, weren't for child she'd terrorized and physically harmed, were instead for herself, for her lost job, for her destroyed reputation, for consequences she'd brought on herself through hatred she'd felt entitled to express. Security officers moved closer to Vicki, moved with purpose that suggested they were preparing to escort her from terminal, moved with hands near restraints that communicated arrest was imminent, and lead officers said, ma'am, you need to come with us. Dallas police are en route to take you into custody for assault. You have right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have right to attorney. And his Miranda warning delivered in airport terminal. Delivered where Vicki had worked for over a decade. Delivered in front of passengers who'd watched her assault Amara, transformed her from authority figure into criminal, from gate agent who controlled boarding into suspect being read her rights. She's escorted toward terminal exit, escorted past hundreds of passengers who'd gathered to watch, escorted through crowd that parted to let her through, and some passengers booed, made sounds of contempt and anger, made sure Vicki knew they'd witnessed her crime and condemned it, and some passengers filmed her perp walk, captured her tear-stained face and her trembling hands, captured evidence that assault had consequences, captured moment that would be shared across social media showing that racism could cost you everything. And one elderly black man standing near the gate, man who'd watched entire confrontation from beginning, man who'd stayed silent like everyone else but whose face showed he understood significance of what had occurred, simply shook his head and said quietly, "God sees everything," said it with weight of lived experience, said it with recognition that Vicki's hatred was nothing new but her consequences were unusually swift, said it with faith that justice sometimes came even when delayed. Airport police arrived to formally arrest Vicki, arrived with handcuffs and paperwork, arrived to process her for assault charges that would be filed within hours, and they placed her in restraints in front of everyone, placed metal cuffs on her wrists while reading additional charges, while explaining she'd be transported to county jail for booking, while making clear this was an administrative issue but criminal matter that would involve prosecutors and judges and potentially years in prison. And Vicki's face showed she still couldn't quite believe this was happening, still seemed to think there must be a way to undo this, still appeared to believe her explanations about suspicious black girl would somehow matter to people who'd watched her kick child. Meanwhile, at Parkland Memorial Hospital, emergency room doors burst open as paramedics rushed Amara inside, rushed her on stretcher toward trauma bay, rushed her with urgency that communicated critical patient requiring immediate intervention, and ER staff mobilized quickly. Mobilized with practiced efficiency, mobilized around unconscious 13-year-old with internal bleeding, and lead trauma surgeon took one look at Amara's vitals, at blood in her vomit, at pallor of her skin, and said, "We need CT scan immediately, possible splenic rupture, possible liver laceration, get surgical team on standby, this child needs emergency surgery," and his assessment, his recognition that Amara's injuries were life-threatening, his immediate escalation to surgical intervention, showed Vicki's kick had caused damage far beyond bruising, had inflicted trauma that required specialists and operating rooms and recovery that would take months. Richard arrived at hospital 7 minutes later, arrived running through emergency room doors, arrived wild-eyed and terrified asking, "Where's my daughter? Where's Amara Hayes? I'm her father," and nurse directed him to trauma bay where doctors were still assessing, where Amara remained unconscious, where her condition remained critical, and Richard pushed through doors to find his daughter, his baby girl who'd been excited that morning, lying pale and still on hospital bed surrounded by machines, with tubes and wires attached to her small body, with doctors discussing surgery, with evidence of violence visible in bruising already forming on her abdomen, and seeing her like that, seeing his child who'd done nothing wrong except try to visit her grandmother, broke something in Richard, made tears fall that he couldn't stop, made rage and grief collide in his chest. Lauren arrived minutes later, arrived having driven faster than safe, arrived with terror written on her face, arrived and saw Richard standing beside their daughter's bed holding Amara's hand, and she rushed to the other side and took Amara's other hand and said, "Baby, Mama's here, you're safe now, we're both here," and her voice broke with sobs, broke with relief that Amara was alive mixed with fury that someone had hurt her, broke with mother's anguish at seeing child in pain, and she looked across the gurney at Richard with eyes that demanded answers, that needed to understand how this had happened, how their careful preparation and documentation and trust in the system had failed to protect their daughter from being assaulted at airport gate, and Richard met her eyes and said gate agent accused her of stealing her ticket, grabbed her, kicked her in the stomach hard enough to cause internal bleeding. She's been unconscious. They're running tests now to see if she needs surgery. And each fact he delivered made Lauren's face crumple further, made her grip on Amara's hand tighten, made her understand the magnitude of violence their daughter had experienced. Amara stirred slightly hearing her parents' voices, stirred with small movement that made monitors beep differently, stirred as consciousness started returning in fragments, in pieces that brought awareness of pain first and then gradually awareness of location, of her parents' presence, of safety that came from knowing they were there, and her eyes fluttered open slowly, open to see her mother's tear-streaked face hovering above her, open to see her father's hand holding hers, open to fluorescent hospital lights that made her squint, and she tried to speak but her throat was raw from vomiting, was dry from oxygen mask, was reluctant to form words. And what came out was whispers so quiet her parents had to lean close to hear. "Baby, I'm here," Lauren said, her face close to Amara's. "Daddy's here. You're safe. You're in the hospital but you're going to be okay. We've got you." And Amara's eyes focused on her mother's face with confusion that showed she didn't remember everything, that trauma had fragmented her memory, that she was trying to piece together how she'd gone from airport gate to hospital bed, and she whispered with voice that broke Lauren's heart, "What happened? Why does it hurt? Where's my backpack?" And her concerns were so innocent, so characteristic of 13-year-old who didn't yet understand the full scope of what had occurred, who was worried about her belongings before understanding her injuries. "You were hurt, sweetie," Richard said gently, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to control for her sake. "Someone hurt you at the airport, but you're safe now, we're here, you're getting excellent care." And Amara's face showed she was trying to remember, was trying to access memories that were there but clouded, and gradually her expression changed from confusion to recognition, changed as she remembered Vicki's face, remembered being accused, remembered the pain of being kicked, remembered falling, and tears started streaming down her face as the memories returned, as she relived the trauma, as she whispered, "I didn't steal anything. I tried to tell her, I showed her my ticket. Why did she kick me? Why did she hurt me?" And her questions were heartbreaking in their incomprehension, were child trying to understand adult cruelty that had no rational explanation. "I know, baby," Lauren said while crying herself. "I know you didn't do anything wrong. That woman was evil. She was racist. She hurt you because she's sick inside, not because you did anything. You're perfect. You're innocent. This isn't your fault." And her reassurance was necessary but insufficient, was attempt to heal wound that went deeper than physical injury, was trying to address trauma that would require therapy to process. And Amara cried harder hearing her mother's words, cried with sobs that made her abdomen hurt where she'd been kicked, cried with pain that was physical and emotional intertwined. The doctor entered and explained that CT scans showed bruising to Amara's spleen and liver, showed internal bleeding that was currently stable but required monitoring, showed injuries that could have been fatal if impact had been slightly different or if medical care had been delayed. And hearing this, hearing how close they'd come to losing their daughter, made Richard and Lauren hold Amara's hands tighter, made them understand that Vicki's assault could have killed her, that luck and quick medical response were all that stood between them and unimaginable loss. And the doctor said, "We're admitting her for observation. She'll need to stay at least 3 days, possibly longer depending on how the bleeding resolves. She'll need rest, no physical activity, careful monitoring, and possibly surgery if bleeding doesn't stop on its own." Amara processed this information with fear showing on her face, with understanding that her injuries were serious, with recognition that assault had caused damage that would take time to heal, and then she whispered the question that broke her parents completely, "Did I miss Grandma's birthday? Is it too late? Will she be upset with me?" And the fact that after everything she'd been through, after being assaulted and hospitalized and told she had internal bleeding, her concern was still for her grandmother's feelings, her worry was still about missing the celebration, showed the sweetness of her character, showed she was still the thoughtful girl who'd made handmade card, showed trauma hadn't destroyed her essential kindness. And Lauren laughed through her tears, laughed with sound that was half sob, and said, "No, sweetheart, Grandma's flying here instead. She wouldn't miss seeing her brave girl. She's more worried about you than about any birthday party." Within hours, Evelyn Hayes arrived at the hospital, arrived having taken first available flight from Phoenix, arrived with face showing 80 years of strength and dignity, arrived as woman who'd survived segregation and Jim Crow and decades of racism but who was devastated that her granddaughter had experienced violence she'd hoped was becoming less common. And she walked into Amara's hospital room and saw her granddaughter connected to monitors with bruises forming on her arms where Vicki had grabbed her, and Evelyn's composure cracked as she approached the bed, cracked as she took Amara's hand gently, cracked as she said, "My sweet girl, my precious brave girl, I'm so sorry this happened to you." And Amara, seeing her grandmother, managed small smile and whispered, "Happy birthday, Grandma. I made you a card. It's in my backpack if they brought it." And Evelyn wept hearing this, wept that granddaughter who'd been assaulted and hospitalized was still thinking about birthday card, was still trying to celebrate despite her pain. Richard had spent the hours since arriving at hospital making calls, making sure prosecution would be aggressive, making sure airline faced consequences, making sure his daughter's assault resulted in systemic changes, and he'd learned that Vicki had been arrested, had been charged with assault on minor and civil rights violations, had been denied bail due to severity of assault and flight risk, was sitting in jail awaiting trial. And he told Amara this, told her the woman who hurt her was facing justice, told her she'd never work in aviation again, told her she'd go to prison, and Amara's response wasn't satisfaction or triumph, wasn't desire for revenge, was simply quiet statement that she hoped Vicki would learn to be kind, that she hoped prison would teach her that hurting people was wrong, and her mercy, her ability to hope for her attacker's redemption even while lying in hospital bed with injuries that woman had caused, showed character that made her family proud and heartbroken simultaneously, proud that she maintained compassion despite trauma, heartbroken that she'd been hurt badly enough to need such forgiveness. 3 weeks passed before the trial began, 3 weeks during which Amara recovered physically but struggled emotionally, 3 weeks of nightmares about being grabbed and kicked, 3 weeks of panic attacks when she saw airports on television, 3 weeks of therapy sessions where she tried to process why adult had hated her enough to hurt her, 3 weeks that transformed excited teenager into cautious child who no longer trusted that following rules would keep her safe, who'd learned that racism could escalate to violence without warning, who discovered that being excellent and polite and prepared couldn't protect her from people who decided her skin color made her criminal, and watching her daughter struggle, watching her flinch at loud noises and avoid crowded spaces and wake up crying from nightmares, broke Lauren's heart in ways that made her fury at Vicki intensify rather than fade, made her determined to see maximum sentence imposed, made her understand that physical healing was fastest part of recovery while psychological healing would take years. The trial was brief because evidence was overwhelming, was prosecuted by district attorney who'd reviewed dozens of witness videos, who'd interviewed passengers who'd watched assault, who'd consulted with Richard Hayes and understood this case needed to send message that assaulting children had severe consequences, and Vicki sat at defense table looking smaller than she'd looked at airport, looking defeated rather than defiant, looking like someone who understood her life was over regardless of verdict, and her attorney tried to argue she'd been stressed, had made mistake, had acted impulsively rather than maliciously, but prosecutor demolished this defense by playing videos showing Vicki's escalating aggression, showing her racist language, showing deliberate decision to kick child who posed no threat, showing assault that was calculated violence rather than momentary lapse. Witnesses testified about what they'd seen, testified with shame in their voices about staying silent, testified about watching Vicki grab Amara and not intervening, testified about filming assault instead of stopping it, testified with recognition that their inaction had enabled escalation, and their testimony wasn't just about Vicki's guilt but about their own complicity, was acknowledgement that bystander silence had consequences, was admission that they'd failed child who'd needed adults to protect her, and jury listened with expressions showing they understood this case was about more than one woman's racism, was about system that allowed such racism to operate, was about collective failure to intervene when intervention could have prevented assault. Medical testimony explained Amara's injuries in detail, explained that kick had caused grade 2 laceration to her spleen, had caused bleeding that required week of hospitalization, had caused trauma that could have resulted in death if bleeding had been worse, had left scars both physical and psychological that would affect her for years. And hearing doctor describe in clinical terms what Vicki's violence had done to 13-year-old's body made several jurors cry, made them understand severity of assault, made them recognize that Vicki had endangered child's life, not just caused her pain, and prosecution rested with statement that Vicki Morrison had committed hate crime, had assaulted minor based on racial profiling, had shown no remorse until facing consequences, deserved maximum sentence under law. The judge, a black woman in her 60s named Justice Patricia Williams who'd spent 40 years on bench, who'd witnessed evolution of civil rights in courtroom, who'd presided over countless discrimination cases, listened to all evidence and then delivered verdict that surprised no one, found Vicki guilty on all counts, guilty of assault on minor, guilty of civil rights violations, guilty of causing serious bodily injury. And then she delivered sentence that made courtroom go silent, made Vicki collapse in her chair, made her attorney request leniency that judge immediately denied, and Justice Williams said with voice that carried weight of decades fighting injustice, "You attacked a child, you attacked 13-year-old girl who was traveling alone to celebrate her grandmother's birthday, you profiled her based on race, you accused her of crimes she didn't commit, you grabbed her hard enough to leave bruises, you kicked her with enough force to cause internal bleeding and unconsciousness, you showed no remorse until you understood consequences were coming, you demonstrated hatred that has no place in civilized society, and this court sentences you to 7 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release, 7 years to contemplate the harm you caused, 7 years to understand that racism has consequences, 7 years that won't undo damage you inflicted but might prevent you from harming anyone else." Vicki collapsed hearing 7 years, collapsed with sound that was half scream half sob, collapsed as reality of spending significant portion of remaining life in prison hit her, and her lawyer immediately requested reconsideration, requested leniency based on her age, requested reduced sentence based on first offense, but Justice Williams denied every request, said assault on child based on racial hatred warranted maximum penalty, said making example of this case might prevent future violence, said Vicki had made her choices and now faced their consequences, and bailiffs took Vicki away in handcuffs while she sobbed and protested, while she finally showed emotion that should have come when she heard Amara, while she faced punishment that would define rest of her life. If you're watching this and you've ever stayed silent while someone was being discriminated against because speaking up felt uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being braver next time, because those passengers who filmed instead of intervening will carry guilt forever, will know their silence enabled assault that hospitalized child. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting vulnerable people matters more than avoiding confrontation. Amara watched from gallery seated between her parents with grandmother holding her hand, watched Vicki being led away and felt complex emotions she struggled to name, felt satisfaction that justice had been served mixed with sadness that anyone could hate enough to do what Vicki had done, felt relief that consequences had come mixed with recognition that 7 years in prison wouldn't heal her trauma, wouldn't erase her nightmares, wouldn't restore her trust, and as Vicki disappeared through courthouse doors, Amara said quietly to her family, "I hope she learns what kindness feels like someday. I hope prison teaches her that hurting people is wrong. I hope she becomes a better person," and her words showed mercy that was extraordinary given circumstances, showed compassion that her attacker hadn't shown her, showed character that made Evelyn squeeze her hand and say, "That's my girl, brave and merciful. That's how we win, by refusing to let hatred make us hateful, by maintaining our humanity even when others lose theirs." But resolution wasn't perfect, wasn't Hollywood ending where justice healed all wounds, because Amara carried scars that 7-year sentence couldn't erase, carried PTSD that required ongoing therapy, carried anxiety about travel that limited her independence, carried surgical scar on her abdomen that reminded her daily of assault, carried knowledge that excellence couldn't protect her from racism, and she struggled for years with nightmares and panic attacks, struggled with hypervigilance in public spaces, struggled with trust that had been shattered, and her parents watched her struggle and felt fury that never fully faded, felt grief for innocence she'd lost, felt helpless to fix damage that Vicki had caused. Vicki served all 7 years in federal prison, served them bitter and largely unrepentant, served them blaming Amara for her imprisonment rather than accepting responsibility, served them surrounded by other inmates who'd committed hate crimes, who'd hurt people based on prejudice, who'd learned consequences existed but hadn't learned compassion, and she was released at 63 years old unemployable and alone, released to life defined by what she'd done, released to die eventually having never truly understood that her victim was human, that her racism had destroyed 2 lives, that her choices at Gate 23 had cost her everything including her soul, and her unrepentant bitterness, her refusal to grow, showed that consequences could punish but couldn't always transform, that justice could imprison but couldn't always heal either victim or perpetrator.